Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 186 of Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the last week of September 2025. In today's podcast, Russia keeps putting pressure on Europe by sending drones, and Trump started mocking Putin and Russia as a weak power, and how Russia responds. As the air and ground war in Ukraine continues at a grueling pace, Moscow is trying to put the more pressure on Kiev's Western allies. On the night of September 10, Russian drones invaded Polish airspace, as you know, and a few days later, Romanian airspace. Then on September 19th, three Russian fighter jets violated Estonian airspace. And now we see Denmark seeing the Russian drones and other European countries. So, as you know, there have also been suggestions that the drones that temporarily closed Copenhagen and Oslo airports overnight might also be linked to the Kremlin. While all this may seem like a deliberate escalation strategy on Putin's part, it is more likely an attempt to mask the fact that Kremlin's narrative of inevitable victory has become more fragile than ever. And you probably would ask why. The failed summer offensive, which resulted in huge casualties, is hardly a cause for celebration. Estimates suggest that Russian military casualties are now approaching 220,000 dead, and yet such a high price has brought Russia only minor territory gains. Let's take a look at that closely. Since the start of its full scale invasion in February 2022, Russia has sized about 70,000 square kilometers, almost tripling the amount of territory it occupies. However, during its latest summer offensive, it managed to capture less than 2,000 square kilometers. As of September 1, 2022, Russia controlled just over 20% of Ukraine territory. 3 years later, it controls 19, compared to 18.5 in early 2025. But perhaps the most telling sign of how hollow the narrative of imminent victory has proven to be is that Russian forces have failed to translate their supposed breakthrough near Pokrovsk in Donbass in August into real territory gains, following a successful counterattack by the Ukrainian forces. The fact that Russia is not winning the war is hardly any consolation for Ukraine. Moscow still has the ability to strike night after night, exposing weaknesses in Ukraine's air defenses and attacking critical infrastructure. The West has also been slow to respond and has yet to send the Kremlin a clear signal about where NATO and the European Union red lines lie. Although the alliance quickly launched Operation Eastern Sentry in response to the Russian drone incursion into Polish airspace, the deterrent effect on this mission appears to be very limited, especially given the subsequent violations of Estonian airspace and unauthorized flights in the neutral zone near Poland and Germany. Following this, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk declared that the country was ready to shoot down flying objects if they violate our airspace and fly over Poland. At the same time, he warned it is important to think twice before making decisions that could provoke a very acute phase of the conflict. On the other side of the Atlantic, US President Donald Trump said little about the growing Russian pressure on NATO's eastern flank. Commenting on the incident with Russian drones over Poland, he suggested that it could have been a mistake before promising that the US would defend NATO allies in the event of any attack by Russia. This is certainly a step forward from his previous threats to NATO solidarity, but it is merely insurance against a major Russian escalation, not a decisive step toward ending the war in Ukraine. In fact, any such step by the US are looking increasingly unlikely. The deadline Trump gave Putin after the summit in Alaska to begin direct peace talks with Ukraine has passed, and nothing has happened since. However, Trump sees Russia as the one who doesn't want to end the war and started taking Ukraine's side. As you know, US President Donald Trump has sparked controversy with a social media post that indicated a major change in his position on the Russian Ukraine war. After months of claiming that Ukraine President Zelensky has no trump cards, it should make a deal involving major concessions to the Kremlin, Trump unexpectedly stated on September 23 that Ukraine was now in a position to find and take back all the territories with its origin borders. Much of Trump's post focused on mocking Putin for his failed campaign in Ukraine. In his typical blunt style, the American leader ridiculed the Russian military's lack of progress and pointed out that Moscow was facing serious economic problems because of its rapidly increasing war expenses. Russia has been fighting a war for 3.5 years, a war that a true military power would win in less than a week, Trump wrote. It doesn't elevate Russia. On the contrary, it makes it look more like a paper tiger. Many commentators quickly interpreted Trump's statement as a sign of a major change in US policy toward Ukraine. However, the post didn't include anything indicating any new approach to relations between Washington and Kiev. On the contrary, Trump highlighted that it is now Europe's turn to take the lead in supporting Ukraine. While the US president has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine can defeat Russia, there is no sign of Washington willing to increase military aid to Kiev or expand sanctions against Moscow. Instead, Trump has only confirmed that the US will continue selling weapons to Ukraine through NATO partners. In other words, the Trump administration's approach to the war seems largely unchanged. However, now, instead of pushing for a peace deal favoring the Kremlin, Trump is openly discussing Ukraine's victory. What caused such a sharp change in tone from President Trump? Putin's long standing tactics and his shameless reneging of his promises undoubtedly played a role, seemingly testing the American leader's patience and making him look foolish after repeatedly claiming a close personal relationship with the Russian president. Trump himself states that his new assessment of the war is based on a detailed understanding of the current military and economic situation in Russia and Ukraine. This view was supported by the US Vice President J.D. Vance, who said this week that Trump is increasingly convinced that this war is extremely detrimental, uh, detrimental to Russia. It is easy to see how intelligence reports on the current situation at the front could have led Trump to change his previous views on Russia's military and economic strength. Putin's summer offensive, which was seen as a possible turning point in the war, clearly didn't succeed. Russian forces failed to make significant gains during this summer month, and progress in creating a border buffer zone in northern Ukraine has stalled. This unimpressive outcome aligns with the overall pattern of the conflict, where Russian forces have captured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory in the past 3 years. These modest territorial gains have come to a very high cost to Russia, although Moscow and Kiev do not release official casualty figures. Independent sources and intelligence reports suggest that hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, with many more wounded. These losses far surpass Russia's combined casualty in all military conflicts since World War II that was ended in 1945. To fill the shrinking ranks of his army, Putin had to offer increasingly generous bonuses to new recruits. However, the catastrophic level of casualties means that even the current steady flow of volunteers might not be enough to sustain the invasion. A sign of the worsening personnel crisis was the deal Putin made with China last year, under which more than 10,000, I'm sorry, with North Korea last year, more than thousands of North Korean soldiers was sent to fight alongside the Russian army. Putin is also clearly struggling on the geopolitical front, with most Russian military sources focused on the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has been unable to protect power elsewhere. Russia did not act when the ongoing conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia flared up again in 2023 and has since been effectively shut out of the peace process between the two countries, challenging Russia's centuries old imperial influence in the region. Similarly, when Syrian dictator Bashar al Assad, a Kremlin ally, faced threats in late 2024, Moscow failed to assist him. The same thing happened recently with Iran. Russia's allies did not intervene even after direct appeals from Tehran during Israel's brief air campaign against the country. As his international influence declines, Putin faces increasing economic difficulties at home. The situation is worsened by Ukraine's growing campaign of airstrikes targeting Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Since early August, Ukraine has launched dozens of attacks on Russian oil refineries, pipelines, pumping stations, and ports. According to many sources, this air offensive has been the most damaging blow to the Russian economy since the start of the war. Processing capacity has significantly decreased in Russia, and energy exports are still declining. Importantly, these attacks have triggered a fuel crisis in many parts of Russia. Long lines form at gas stations, supplies are interrupted, and prices are hitting record heights when the economy is already bleeding. Russia's failure to defend critical energy infrastructure for Ukrainian long range drones clearly shows how overwhelmed its armed forces are. The limited air defense systems are either focused on the front lines or used to protect large cities, and the personnel residence of Putin and his officials. Residence of Putin and his officials. There are simply not enough resources to safeguard the extensive oil and gas network that drives the Russian military machine. For the Kremlin, this is a very concerning signal. Ukraine clearly aims to systematically dismantle Russia's energy sector and is actively developing its own domestically produced cruise missiles for this purpose. If, as expected, such weapons become more common in the coming months, Kyiv's capacity to strike deep into Russian territory will grow significantly. The current difficult military and economic situation largely explains why Trump decided to call Russia a paper tiger. This sharp statement clearly resonated with Russians. Many of them are probably already starting to feel anxiety about the worsening domestic situation and the lack of significant progress by the Russian army in Ukraine. Militarized bloggers and Kremlin experts quickly rushed to refute Trump's words and mock his comments about the paper tiger, and Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov felt it necessary to personally respond to this insult. Russia is not a tiger. Russia is a traditionally perceived as a bear. There are no paper bears. Russia is a real bear, he stated in a rather peculiar radio interview. Putin has so far remained silent, but he is probably holding back his anger. The Kremlin leader is known for his almost mafia-like obsession with respect and has not hidden his bitterness over losing superpower status after the Soviet Union collapse. Putin was reportedly deeply insulted when US President Barack Obama called Russia a mere regional power in 2014 during the invasion of Ukraine. Now he may be haunted by Trump's paper tiger comment, which targets his imperial complexes. Putin saw the invasion of Ukraine as a key step into the injustice of the USSR's collapse and rebuild the Russian Empire. He hoped for a quick victory to alter the global power dynamic and place Russia back among the world's top nations. But instead, the war has brutally shown the limits of the Russian military. Today, Putin's troops are still stuck in the intense fighting for control of villages near the original front line, the same one from which the invasion started more than 3.5 years ago. At sea, the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea has been broken, and most of Putin's navy has been forced to retreat from Crimea. Despite having one of the largest air forces in the world, Russia has never been able to gain air superiority over Ukraine. In fact, it has been unable to stop Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia itself. With such inconclusive results, it is no surprise that Russian military reputation has suffered significantly since 2022. Putin still commands a large and powerful military capable of causing damage and suffering, but few today see Russia as a global superpower. Trump's harsh paper tiger remark was meant as an insult, but it may actually be closer to the truth that Putin would like to admit. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.